Guess we're going to go ahead and get started. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to have a discussion about assigning roles for during competition. I'm going to briefly mention CS Labs before jumping into my Linux basics and files lecture. I'm going to assign a little bit of homework for next time, and then I'm going to go ahead and take any questions anyone here might have. So these are the roles that are available right now for the competition that we'll have to have filled. So we'll have to have a Splunk Phantom administrator, which is going to take care of the Splunk and Phantom applications running on CentOS servers. By the way, I've ranked these servers in order of difficulty, with the ones at the top being the most difficult, going down to the least difficult at the bottom. So for the most difficult, we've got a Splunk Phantom admin. I've listed that at the top just because it means administering 2 servers instead of just one. Below that, we've got the Ubuntu DNS administrator. We've got a Debian database administrator, a Windows 2008 Active Directory administrator, a Fedora mail server administrator, and finally a Windows 10 inject coordinator. So we'll go ahead and talk about that now. Zaid, do you have any idea where you would like to be on this chart? You have like preferences, you have like amazing skills with DNS that I'm not aware of, or anything like that?
Honestly, I'm a beginner too. But I have experience using the Linux command line. So Ubuntu, Debian, even Windows should be fine for me.
Okay, so if you have some Linux experience, I'll go ahead. How do you feel about being the Debian database administrator?
I actually have no experience with the Debian database administrator.
So have you ever heard of MySQL?
MySQL, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's what that is.
Oh, okay. Oh, basically.
Yeah, that's all it is. You'll just have a Debian server, which is what Ubuntu is based on. You'll have one of those with MySQL.
So for the Ubuntu DNS administrator, what is that?
So basically, it's exactly what it sounds. You'll have a bind DNS server running on an Ubuntu instance.
Oh, got it.
So which one do you think? One sounds more appealing to you at the moment?
At the moment, I might take the Debian database administrator.
All right,
If
I'll go
it's
ahead and put you down to that. If something changes, if you look into it and go, that might look a little too much, we can always see if we can shuffle you around. So I'll go ahead and write you down for that. Cooper, what are you thinking for our competition so far? Just looking at the list we got here.
I'm not really sure.
So what do you know and what do you want to know? I guess should be a better question to ask you.
I have a little bit of Linux experience too, but other than that, I don't know a ton. So
have you ever messed with Active Directory in any shape or form?
I don't think so.
Okay, how do you feel about Windows servers, like Server 2008? I'm not expecting you to know this stuff. I'm just trying to get a general idea of where I want to train you at and what you're interested in.
Okay.
So if you don't have like a ton of experience, you don't have to have a ton of experience. And if you don't, just try to pick something that kind of jumps out at you that you think you'd be interested in.
Okay. Is there like more on these roles somewhere?
If you have questions, I can go ahead and answer them. I've got them ranked from what I consider to be the most difficult to the least difficult, with the most difficult at the top.
Okay.
There is a little bit about them on the CSG, the CCDC website, the handbook, but there's not too much. But if you had specific questions, I could pretty easily answer them. I've worked on just about all of these boxes at some point or another. All right, well, we'll come back to that in a few minutes because I definitely want to go ahead and get that assigned today as best I can. All right, so I will go ahead and briefly mention CS Labs. It's an environment. It's like kind of like a virtual environment that the CSG has put together using our infrastructure. You can access it by taking a look by going onto the CSG website and clicking on the CS Labs tab. So there are units that we'll be using through it in the future, but we won't be touching it specifically today. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into Linux basics. So the very first thing we're going to cover today is the Linux file system tree, which is basically just how all of the files and folders in Linux are laid out. Files and folders are very, very important in Linux, even more so than in a typical computer, because everything in Linux is a file or is represented by a file. So the file system starts out at the very, very top level. The tree starts out at the root, often represented as a slash, and it kind of branches out the further down you go. If you take a look at the handout that I posted in the CCDC channel on Discord, it kind of explains what these directories actually mean. And I've got a little graph down here to give you an idea of kind of the first level of the structure. So we've got /bin for system binaries, /boot for bootloader configuration files, /dev for devices, /etc for configuration files, /home for users' home directories, and so on and so forth. You don't need to memorize these, and don't be in a hurry to write these down because, like I said, these are on the handout. But that's certainly helpful to know just as you're getting into Linux systems. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Linux shells. With Linux, you primarily interact with it via the command line versus something like Windows where you've got start menus and things like that. With Linux, it's just a command line interface. So on the initial login to your machine at CCDC, you're going to be given a shell prompt that kind of looks like this. And all this means is that it's going to be in the format your username at the system's host name, a colon, and then where your working directory, which just indicates where you are in the file system tree relative to the root. So I'll give it a little more on the next slide. You can see a little bit more of that. So this kind of explains how you can navigate the file system. If you look right here, you can see an example of an actual system prompt for my system. So we can see my username, my system's host name, and where I am on the file system in under root in etc, which contains the system configuration files. So to move around in the file system tree, there's kind of three commands you need to primarily know. First one is ls, which is kind of like just lists the contents of your current directory. So you can, and we've also got cd, which means change directory. So you can either input a path relative to the root of the file system or your current file system, and that'll change where you're working, so to speak. So you can see here, let me clear that. You can see here I've attached a screenshot of a shell where I've kind of done some navigating. So the first thing, I started out in etc, and I did cd pulse, which pulse is a directory inside of etc. So you can see here that the end of my shell updates to indicate that I've navigated inside of pulse. And then I issue the ls command, which then outputs kind of a list of files that are inside of the pulse directory: client.conf, daemon.conf, default.pa, that sort of thing. You can also see where I issue the pwd command, print working directory, which essentially just shows you this part of your shell prompt. It just shows you your print working directory. So that's kind of the basics of what you need to know to navigate your file system. Obviously, this is something you're going to practice a little bit. Seeing it on the slides and actually doing it is it's a little different. The next thing we're going to briefly go over is file permissions. Like most computer systems, files and directories have permissions associated with them. So not just everyone can read a file or edit a file. To take a look at the permissions, you're going to again use the ls command with the -L flag, and it's going to output something like this here. So here you can see this bit here is the permissions bits. So the way these are formatted is something I like to call UGO. So at the first 3 bits you see here, -RW, indicate the owning user or use permissions. So in this case, you can see we've got the owning user has the read permissions R and the write permissions W. Next, we go on to the G, which is the owning group, whatever group owns the file. You can see they've got blank, read, blank. So in this case, they can only read the file. And then we've got others, or O, which is the last three letters of this string. So in this case, you can see they've just got R, or read. So as you notice, there's always 3 different levels of permissions that both the owning user, the owning group, and everyone else can have, and that's read, R, W, write, and X, execute. Some other things you can see from this layout, you can actually see the owning user and owning group. In this case, the owning user is me, Adam, and the owning group is a group named users. So Adam, in this case, would have read, write. The users group would just have read, and everybody else would just have read permissions as well. Some other things you can see the last time this file was either modified or created. It depends, just depending on your system, and the name of the file, main.py. So to manage these permissions, you're going to use 2 different commands. chmod changes those file permissions bits, the rwx, that's what actually changes them. And then chown changes the file's owners. So to use chmod, you're going to go chmod, and you're going to specify if you want to edit the owning user, U, the owning group, G, or O's file permissions. And then you're going to specify plus or minus to say if you're adding or removing permissions. In this case, you can see I've got minus, so I'm removing permissions. You then specify the letters of the permissions you want to remove. So in this case, this command will remove the R and W read and write permissions from others on main.py. The other thing you can do, chown changes the file's owner, so it changes who the U, the owning user, and the G, the owning group, who they actually are. And you just do that by specifying chown, the new owning user, a colon, and then the new owning group, and then of course the name of your file. And if you were to issue ls-l afterwards, you would see that all those values have been updated. So your homework for next time, obviously I'll post these in a slightly more accessible format so where you can actually click them. There's 2 YouTube videos I want you to watch. This first one, you'll be able to stop at 7 minutes, 15 seconds. And the other one you can just watch all the way through. They're just going to give you a basic overview of our next topic, which will be Linux packages and services. At this point, I'll go ahead and take any questions. If anything in here, if you want to go back later and get a more in-depth look at some of the topics I covered today, I'll also post a 3rd YouTube video that contains a lot more, some supplementary information, and goes a little bit slower through some of those topics, if that might be helpful. So I'll go ahead and take questions now if you all have them.
Is the CCDC going to be virtual this time?
Yes, it is. Usually we always competed virtually, like we don't
Oh,
actually travel anywhere. But when
mhm,
we did it, we usually met up in person on one of the labs on campus, and just
mhm.
all sat in a room and competed from there. We will
I
not be doing that this year just because of coronavirus restrictions. So it's likely there's going to be a big Zoom call or a big Discord call or something of that nature.
got it. Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions? Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and loop back around to our roles. Cooper, have you had any thoughts regarding any of these roles?
Not in particular. No.
Okay. Just as soon as you can, take a look at them, do some Googling, just kind of figure out what it is you might be interested in, and let me know because that's kind of going to be your main area of research going into the competition.
Okay.
Last call. Any questions before we call it a day?
Nope.
Alrighty. Thank you all for attending. I'll be sure to post the YouTube links with all the homework and stuff like that. And I believe we have our next training session in about 2 weeks. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks.